Oh, hello there. I'm Otter, and I talk about queer media. And I've got news for you. Your world building is incomplete, unless you factor in queer people. Whether you're writing a book or designing a tabletop RPG campaign, building a world from scratch is a massive undertaking, one where you have to look at everything from complex political machinations to what the locals named a river. But one aspect that is overlooked by countless straight world builders is how the cultures treat queer people. Now you may be saying, but Otter, all my characters are straight, which is a choice, an extremely limiting choice that comes off as wildly unrealistic, but let's say you make the terrible choice to only include straight characters. That still doesn't mean that your world can be a vacuum where no queer people exist. In nature, there's usually an exception to any rule, and those exceptions in regards to sex and gender are what we consider queer. Humans are only male or female, except for when they aren't. Females only have 2 X chromosomes, except for when they don't. Males and females are only attracted to each other, except for when they're not, etc., etc. Homosexuality has been observed in over 1,500 species. It's frankly unrealistic to have a world without it, and even fantasy creatures need to have queerness factored into their cultures. The idea of, well, in my world, everyone's straight, just will never read as realistic because humans never have been and never will be only cisgendered and heterosexual. It also means that you're missing out on an extra level of creative depth that you can add to your story. Now you might be thinking, what do you mean creative depth? Either a culture accepts queer people or it doesn't. And here I would argue that you're thinking too small. There are countless nuanced ways that you can incorporate queer lives into your world building. Yes, the most obvious might be to simply mirror Western Christian treatments of queer people, either before or after the gay rights movement. But even those have nuance. Not everyone before 1960 was inherently homophobic, just as not everyone in modern times is inherently accepting. Even today, there are 69 countries that still consider homosexuality illegal, and 6 of them will give you the death penalty for it. There are so many ways to incorporate queer people into your world building that aren't just everyone either being accepting or homophobic. Maybe there's a culture that venerates non-binary people, and all priests in that culture are non-binary. Or you could have a society where queer people do certain jobs. Maybe all the astronauts are gay to prevent pregnancies in space. Or maybe queer people are shunned by society and have created their own country full of immigrants from all of the homophobic nations. I could go on, but at the end of the day, it's going to be different based on each case because every world is different. But if you're looking for a place to start, I'd start by looking at what other authors have done before you. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of how authors have incorporated queer people into their world building. 2 examples where it's a small factor that adds depth to the world, and one where it's a major factor that drives plot and language. Now, publishers haven't always allowed explicit queer representation. In fact, it's pretty much a product of the 21st century. But that doesn't mean that queer representation hasn't existed in books prior to that. They just had to be a little bit more subtle about it. A book that was written in the 1990s, when the industry was just starting to get better about queer representation, is The Golden Compass by Phillip Pullman. With a straight protagonist who's naive to things like adult sexuality, you may be thinking, well, we don't have to address queer people here because it isn't relevant to the story. But adding in queer representation subtly through the lens of the character adds depth to the world that otherwise wouldn't be there. Phillip Pullman introduces us to a world where half of your soul exists outside of your body as an animal companion called a demon. And it is established that these demons are the opposite gender to their human counterpart, except in the rare instance that the 2 are the same gender, and people have interpreted those same gender demons as queer individuals. Now, the author himself has stated, occasionally, no doubt, people do have a demon of the same sex. That might indicate homosexuality, or it might indicate some other sort of gift or quality, such as second sight. I do not know, but I do not have to know everything about what I write. You may be saying, Otter, he only says that it might mean that they're queer, not that they certainly are. Well, here's the thing. He touches on something important there. Authors don't necessarily need to know about every single aspect of what they're writing. And I'm not arguing in this video that you have to tie every aspect of your world into queerness. But there's no doubt that people in this world with same-gendered demons are some form of queer. If nothing else, they are an exception to a rule of a gender dichotomy. And that's what we established earlier means queer to us. These people might not be transgendered or homosexual, but we don't know. And a reader looking at that who is queer will read that and most likely see them as transgender and not able to publicly be their true gendered self, but their soul can. In a world like Pullman's that's dominated by a conservative religious institution, it makes the most sense that queer people would not be able to be openly honest about their gender and sexuality. Also, with this story being told through the eyes of the child, then we don't necessarily need to go in depth into the implications of what this means. But its inclusion adds depth and creates debates amongst the fans. He acknowledges that queer people exist in his world while keeping the focus on his straight characters. If nothing else, a complete world needs to include this minimal effort. In The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker, the first book in a trilogy that has come out within the last few years, we see a more nuanced look at how queer aspects can deepen world building while having zero effect on the main character's arc. The world that Barker has built is ruled by women, and the leader is chosen by who has given birth to the most able-bodied children. This entire world revolves around childbearing, and that goes down to what jobs different people have. For instance, the men whose only job is to father the children of the leaders are all straight, and it is considered a huge offense to imply otherwise about them. Now, you may be thinking that this just sounds like a homophobic society, but outside of these kept men, there are no societal taboos about gender or sexuality. There are even fully accepted non-binary individuals in this culture. But on naval ships, men and women are strictly forbidden from sleeping with each other, and only homosexual pairings are allowed in order to reduce the risk of pregnancy aboard a ship. This book is entirely devoid of any romantic subplots, and the main character's sexuality is never even addressed. But queer world building is used to deepen and expand this world, even if it has little to no effect on the plot. In another more recent series, we can see the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Mike Brooks' King Chronicles integrates queer world building so that it informs the aspects of the story. This series focuses on the culture clashes between neighboring nations. In it, we're introduced to the Neridians, who have a strict hierarchical social structure, where men are above women. Therefore, their gender roles are strictly enforced. But their neighbors to the north are quite the opposite. In the City of Islands, there are 5 different genders, and no hierarchy. This informs not only the tensions between the nations, but how individuals treat each other, and plays a major part in how their languages are structured. The Northern Alabon language uses tonal variation. Words like me, you, or pronouns are all the same root word, but said with different tonal variations to indicate one of the 5 genders. This is written in the text with accent marks above the vowels. They also have a non-gendered neutral tone with no accent marks to indicate someone whose gender that you don't know. This is because the culture sees gender as something personal, and it would be extremely rude to assume anyone's gender by simply looking at them. This makes for tension with the Neridians, who insist that someone's gender is based solely on their genitalia. Here, a queer aspect of world building is an instrumental building block in the world's foundations. It informs language, politics, and interpersonal relationships. Having a culture that not just accepts queer people, but is intrinsically built to easily navigate gender variation, neighboring a strictly gendered society builds tension into the foundations of this world. In this way, Brooks sets up these cultures to clash through how he's built this world around gender. And he also does the same thing for sexuality with 2 other cultures, furthering the themes that he's exploring in the process. These are just 3 examples, though. As I said earlier, there are countless ways to create nuanced world building through the queer members of society. Not every story needs to have 5 genders and gay sailors. Your world is unique, and queer characters will inherently navigate that differently. But unless you put in the effort to figure out how they do, your world is incomplete. So as you're naming your rivers and plotting out political power structures, ask yourself, who are the exceptions to the gender and sexuality rules, and how are they treated? Thank you for sticking with me to the end. I hope that I haven't rambled on too long and that I've given you something interesting to think about. But these are just my opinions. I want to know what you think about queer world building and whether or not it's essential. So let me know in the comments below. But please, I just ask that you be respectful of each other down there, because this can be a touchy subject, and everyone is probably going to have slightly differing opinions. I want healthy debates, not nasty arguments. Anyways, I've been Otter, and have a good one. Recording in a city is hard because the cops are always driving by with sirens.